And Ryan, before we get into the today's topic, which is Bull Halsey, the great naval commander, before we get to anything else, Ryan has a disclaimer he'd like to tell us about.
Yes, before I talk about my book, anything I say today are my views and my views alone, and not those of the Naval War College, the U.S. Navy, or the Department of Defense.
Thank you. The book, though, sounds interesting. What is Selling Sea Power about?
So, Selling Sea Power is about the U.S. Navy's attempts to essentially build its own internal public relations capacity between the world wars. Prior to that, it's not that the Navy hadn't engaged the public. Prior to that, Hahn becomes famous in the 1890s for his writings. There are other officers who are engaged at various points with trying to curry public favor and also congressional failure for the U.S. Navy. But this was not really done as in any kind of systematic way. There are some external organizations such as the Navy League of the United States that are helping out with this, which is more of a lobbying group as opposed to like a mass movement, which is what you see for Navy leagues overseas. But in large part because of the U.S. Navy's experience during World War I and the tenure of Josephus Daniels, the Secretary of the Navy for the entirety of Woodrow Wilson's administration, the Navy becomes more interested in public relations. And in 1922, there's finally a critical mass to create the Navy's first public relations office. And from that office, which is known as the Information Section of the Office of Naval Intelligence, it's the direct ancestor to what is now the Navy's Office of Information.
What years does the book cover?
So the book covers mostly 1917 to 1941. So there's a wartime agency that Daniels stocks with a bunch of old newspapermen. It's not really a Navy organization. But that organization more or less collapses after the war due to budget cuts. It's not really seen as a priority. But a series of public relations problems that the Navy's confronting in the early 1920s, demobilization, naval disarmament, Billy Mitchell, forced the Navy to start paying systematic attention to public relations.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. There's always a discussion point of when the U.S. became a world power. Was it after the Spanish-American War, 1898? Was it after World War I, 1918? But I think it's more, when did we have an effective Navy? And we're going to talk about the circumnavigation here in a little bit with Halsey. Yeah, I wonder what year people think, even after 1945, after World War II.
I mean, the U.S. Navy, so one of the things that drives very indirectly the Navy's interest in public relations is the Navy is growing very rapidly. In the first couple of decades of the 20th century, there's the Naval Act of 1916, which is going to put the U.S. on pace to surpass even British sea power in terms of size. But wartime exigencies force a lot of the ships that are authorized in the 1916 Act to be delayed in favor of subchasers, destroyers, other things that can have more immediate benefit for the war effort. Britain still has plenty of battleships to keep the Germans covered down by that point in the war. But in some ways, the post-war fights over the U.S. Navy and sea power in general are really driven by the long-term concerns over the growth trajectory of the U.S. Navy, in part from the British, but also from the Japanese. And so fearing a new arms race is going to develop, leads to arms limitation, and by extension kind of helps get the Navy interested in how do you get the public to care about the Navy after we've just signed these treaties that are going to limit the size of navies for the foreseeable future.
Right. And we'll get into it here with Halsey's biography, but it almost kind of mirrors the growth of the U.S. Navy on a global scale. Well, William Bull Halsey was born in October 1882 in Elizabeth, New Jersey. What do we know about his upbringing?
One thing I think that is going to color a lot of our conversation today is the fact that the story that Halsey sometimes told about himself and the stories that I think most people think that they know about Halsey are often these exaggerated stories about him. I mean, and to some degree, he does realize he's become this caricatured figure later in life.
Yeah, he almost seems like a naval Patton in a way.
Yeah, and so he's often compared to Patton, even during the war, but also after the war. But, I think one thing to keep in mind is that Halsey does a good job of kind of building this legend on his own. During the war, he recognizes that he has kind of this part to play. And the fascinating thing is Halsey during the war says some pretty vile things, maybe not entirely out of context for other things that are being seen in public spaces during the war. But after the war, his tone shifts very quickly. And it's all part of this persona that he puts on during the war and just trying to motivate Americans, but also his sailors into fighting more effectively.
But you wonder if was that an upbringing thing or was that just something he developed?
I think over time, his upbringing, so his father was in the Navy. So this is where the trying to figure out exactly what is true about Halsey's biography versus not. So actually, you can find some biographies kind of lean into what is Halsey's version of his background. And so there are a couple of seagoing types, mariners, in Halsey's background, but they are quite distant and in some ways on different branches of the family tree than his. For the most part, his direct descendants or ancestors are relatively genteel types. And so he's not quite upper crust at quite at the top tier of society, but he's close. And so his family actually comes from relatively decent means. So his father, though, was a naval officer. In family context, his father was William, and then he was Bill. But the elder William Halsey was a naval officer. I mean, from what we can tell, it looked like the elder William was looking for just kind of an escape of just the humdrum routine of kind of what some of the expectations that the family had brought. Also, I think just trying to escape to some degree just New York during the mid 19th century, and so he enters the Navy and has a relatively long career. And so this is Bill's I think really direct role model in terms of why does he eventually become interested in Navy.
Yeah, he takes an unusual path to the Naval Academy. He first studies medicine at UVA, University of Virginia, my mom's alma mater.
My advisor's alma mater. He went to UVA too.
Huh? Great school. So, what were his college years like?
So he ends up at UVA and going into medicine. I think in part because he has trouble securing an appointment to the Naval Academy. His family tries to use various connections to secure an appointment back when congressmen could appoint two people from their districts. That is going to be a little harder for young Bill just because his father had moved around somewhat. And so even though there are family ties going back to New York and the upper mid-Atlantic, they don't really have quite the same rooted home life. His dad was moving around often enough, and that's one of the things that shapes Bill's upbringing. Actually, at one point, young Bill tries to get an appointment directly from President McKinley, and that fails the first time. And so it's after that when he's searching about for what do I do now. He ends up doing basically his freshman year at UVA, wants to study medicine, but it's fairly clear, I think, based on kind of where his life goes, that seemed in some ways driven by the fact that he had a friend there who was going to be going to UVA. And so that seems to drive his interest in UVA more than anything else.
Well, what I like about him is he seems to be a lifelong learner. Like we'll get into it in a little bit. He learns to become a pilot at age 52. Like it seems like he's always trying to learn new things.
Yeah, I don't think he will ever mistake Halsey for an intellectual. In fact, I think one of his biographers noted that he wrote exactly one professional piece in his life. He reviewed a book for the Naval Institute's proceedings in, I think, the early 1920s. I think is the only time he ever wrote something. But yeah, so it's not that he's incapable of learning or not interested in things, but I will say his interest could wax and wane depending on what you're talking about.
Right. He gets out of the military academy, and his early military service is spent on 16 battleships within the Great White Fleet. And this was the U.S. fleet's circumnavigation of the world in the early 1900s. What is this Great White Fleet about? Is it an announcement to the world that the U.S. is a major power now? Is it a trade thing? Is it a diplomacy thing? What's going on here?
It's a little bit of all of those. The Great White Fleet, which the cruise spans from late 1907 to early 1909, comprising what at that point were the Navy's newest battleships, though there are still new ships under construction at the time the Great White Fleet steams out of Hampton Roads and starts heading south into the South Atlantic in 1907. But yes, it's an announcement of American naval prowess. There is a foreign policy function to this. So one of the major visits of the Great White Fleet is to Australia. And so this is at a period in which Australia, on and off, they're trying to figure Australia, as they have some autonomy within for their own foreign policy, they're trying to figure out exactly how reliable of a security partner Britain is to them. And so there's these on and off attempts in the first few decades of the 20th century to court better ties with the United States. And so the Great White Fleet coming to Australia is in some ways a part of that. So they go there, they visit Japan. Yeah, in 1908. And then they end up steaming through the Suez. Halsey has a great time on the cruise at one point when the ship that he's serving on, which is the Kansas, stops at a port along the French Riviera. He actually goes and crashes his sister's honeymoon. She's honeymooning in France. Yeah, it's a formative experience for him. I think just because of it represents just the pinnacle of U.S. naval power to that time, and I think it kind of opens his eyes to what can you do with sea power.
Well, Halsey also serves on a few torpedo boats and eventually commands a few destroyers. And I guess now is as good a time to talk about his leadership style. I've seen pictures of him dining with his crew. Like most great commanders, he seems very energetic yet demanding. What was his style like?
So the thing that always comes up with Halsey's leadership style is outsiders who visited his ship said he ran a happy ship. And so this really came down to, in some ways, his style of discipline. And so the best way to describe it is that if he felt like a sailor or an officer had violated some core tenet of the profession, he would really go after them hard. And occasionally examples are made of certain individuals for these types of infractions. But for, I would say minor infractions, these types of things, he tends to try to have an atmosphere of forgive and forget. And what's interesting is he can make this work on his own ships. As I said, everyone who comes to visit his ships says that they are happy ships, they are efficient ships, they do what they need to do. But then people who end up coming in afterwards who have very different leadership styles feel like they end up having to clean house a little bit. And so there's a couple of instances after Halsey relinquishes command where someone comes in and ends up running things rather differently. But I think it speaks to his, he's very gregarious, he's very outgoing, he's very friendly. As someone who in his earlier years who had sometimes, I think gotten into, I would say, a reasonable amount of youthful trouble. I think this is where his sense of discretion over how do I treat certain offenses really comes in. And so you sense that even during his earliest commands, he's already building up this reputation as someone who his men will follow, unequivocally. But recognizing that there's a little bit of a push-pull in the relationship between the crew and their captain.
Yeah. Well, at the age of 52, he becomes an aviator. I think one of the oldest aviators in the military.
Yes.
Why do you think he took an interest in learning how to fly?
I think there's a few things. So first off, there is an interest that he shows in technology on and off throughout his career. In particular, he's the U.S. naval attaché to Germany for a while in the 1920s. So if you look at his attaché reports, Tom Hughes, in his great biography of Halsey, talks about this, that when it comes to some things that you see attachés normally report on, Halsey doesn't really show a whole lot of interest in that. On the other hand, as he's looking at German aviation as it's trying to find its way in the 1920s, also some of the nascent things of very nascent stages of what eventually becomes German rearmament, Halsey has enough knowledge of that and interest in it. So he spends a lot of time in his attaché reports detailing what he sees and what he can find out about German aviation. But even prior to that, he'd had a few interactions with aviation earlier in his career. When he's at the Naval Academy for a while in the 1920s, actually this is after his time as the attaché. This is when the aviation detachment is placed under his command. He's in command of the Reina Mercedes, which is a captured Spanish ship that's doing essentially administrative things for the Academy. So he becomes interested in aviation through that. And there's a bit of a false start. His allies and friends try to get him into the Naval Aviation Observer course. I'll talk about that here in a minute. In the late 1920s, he fails the exam, the first time, the eye exam. And so it's only on the second try in which he's able to convince all the parties that he can at least make the observer course. But then once he arrives in Pensacola, so even though there's only 2 officers in his class that are over 30, and he's like 20 years older than the next oldest officer, he actually convinces everyone to let him get his full wings instead of just going through the observer course. And so A little bit about the observer course. So when the Navy really becomes invested in aviation in the 1920s, um, the father of naval aviation, who's Rear Admiral William Moffett, really another really interesting guy. Moffett helps push through this stopgap measure because he recognizes that there's not enough mid-career and senior officers to command naval aviation ships and stations at that point, because all of the aviators who are the most senior aviators are still relatively junior in rank. And so you need a way to get more senior officers into those billets because I mean it's there are very good reasons for why they make sure that legally only aviators can have command of those ships and stations. And so the observer course is a way of getting mid-career and senior officers into positions where they can command those ships and stations, while the next generation of lifelong aviators can eventually reach those echelons. And so for Halsey, by the time he enters the observer course and eventually goes into the full pilot training course, he is probably recognizes that he is not going to reach flag rank on his own.
Mm-hmm.
He's like, his class rank standing was not great. Like, he's in like the 30th percentile of his Naval Academy class. He's already old because by this point he's in his 50s. And so this is a way for officers who felt like that their careers were going to stall out to find new ways of career advancement.
Well, I think there's something else to it. He had kind of a can-do attitude, and
Yeah.
he wasn't afraid to try new things. And I think you look for that, whether it's the military or in the business world. You want guys who are like, yeah, I can do that. Who aren't afraid to try new things.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think his adventurousness kind of plays a role in this as well. One thing that I also find interesting about his time in aviation is he very quickly recognizes that, because in the mid 30s, the Navy is still trying to figure out. At that point they've been operating aircraft carriers for about a decade. The larger ones really for only about 5 years by the time Halsey enters aviator training down in Pensacola. And so they're still trying to figure out what is the best way to use these ships. And one of the things I think that comes out of that makes Halsey a good fit for this is he recognized that some of the tactics that you need to use to operate carriers at sea are at least spiritually similar to how he wanted to operate destroyers. So using them for hit and run attacks, emphasizing their speed, emphasizing their mobility, emphasizing their offensive potential in a way that more conservative officers in the U.S. Navy, they're still thinking of carriers as just very basic platforms for fleet defense. Halsey is thinking of these things in terms of raiding platforms and offensive strike platforms.
I think that's a great point. Just because they're big like battleships doesn't mean they should be used in the same way. Like you said, use them as hit and run and not to slug it out with battleships.
Yeah. And well, so this is a going into the weeds moment. So forgive me. One of the things that also drives this in the 1930s is the Navy is struggling to figure out how to protect aircraft carriers. And so in war games that are being conducted here at the Naval War College in the 20s and 30s, but also in the Navy's fleet problems, which are their annual exercises from the period whenever they're using aircraft carriers, they are very easily knocked out by enemy air attacks. There's a couple of times where they run across surface ships, but the main concern that carriers that the Navy has for carrier operations in the 30s is how you're going to protect them, because you don't have radar. Spotting incoming attacks is difficult, and so there are times when a carrier will be steaming along in an exercise, and all of a sudden, squadrons of enemy aircraft fly over the carrier, attack it, and knock it out of action. And it's not really a problem. It's a problem that takes several technological advances to solve during the war, among them radar, among them better anti-aircraft guns, among them better fighter direction. So it's a multi-stage process to solve this. But for aviators like Halsey and those who share his views, it's very much about you need to keep the carrier moving in order to decrease the risk to the platform.
Yeah, I mean they're big. They're not exceptionally fast. I mean they're big targets, and it's hard to protect them.
Mm-hmm.
Well, World War II begins for the U.S. with the Pearl Harbor attack by the Japanese in December 1941. Halsey sums up his strategy, quote, "Get to the other fellow with everything you have as fast as you can and then dump it on him, end quote. This sounds very Napoleonic-esque to me. Get there fast and be as violent as possible. Is this accurate?
In a lot of ways, yes. So Halsey, when the war starts, he's in command of one of the Navy's carrier task forces. So by just before the war starts for the United States, Admiral Husband Kimmel, who's the commander of the Pacific Fleet out at Pearl, builds 3 task forces around his carriers, and Halsey's in command of one of them. And so all 3 of the carriers are off doing other things when the Japanese strike on December 7th. And so it's one of the great regrets of the Japanese, the fact that they never find the American carriers at Pearl Harbor, which is really what they one of the things that they were looking for. Halsey's task group had gone out to Wake to drop off Marine fighters, and so they missed by a few hundred miles the Japanese at Pearl Harbor. They sail into Pearl Harbor on December 8th. They see the wreckage, they see the carnage, and then they immediately go back out to sea again. But the first thing that Halsey does, and this is where he really starts to become known to the public, is he's the most aggressive of the carrier commanders in the early months of the war, as they're trying to keep the Japanese off balance, and trying to build up morale at home, and also just trying to gain some combat experience. Halsey helps lead several raids on Japanese island possessions in the Central Pacific.
Is this when he gets his nickname?
Yeah, this is where that comes from. Some of this is also his physical appearance. Halsey has, shall we say, a rather peculiar physical build. So he has a very large head. So I think his hat size was rated at 7 7/8. I have a big head, and mine's only like 7 1/4. He's got this kind of barrel-chested, very thick middle, and then he's got these short, stubby legs. And so bulldog kind of comes out of that. And so, yeah, it's so in some ways it's a play on his physical appearance, but it's also a play on his aggressiveness. And so Halsey leads a daring raid on the Marshalls in early 1942, follows that up with a raid on Wake, and then leads a raid on Marcus Island, which is not that far from Japan. And these raids don't really cause a lot of damage at the time, but they're morale boosters. They give the ships combat experience. And then right after that, the Enterprise is his flagship during these early months of the war. Halsey and Enterprise rendezvous with Hornet, and they provide the escort for the Hornet when the Hornet launches the Doolittle Raid on Japan on April 18th of 1942.
Yeah. Famous Doolittle's attack on Japan as a quick retribution act and a morale booster, like you said.
Yeah. Again, not something that's causing much in the way of damage, and it's a risky plan. It puts, when the Navy only has a few carriers that are operable in the Pacific, and by this point they're starting to recognize that because Nimitz doesn't really want to send the battleships, either the few battleships he has that are even those that are back in service out to sea. For the most part, they are just guarding the sea lanes between Hawaii and California. And so already by this point, the carriers are taking the lead on the Navy's responses to the Japanese.
Yeah, you mentioned he's involved in the 1942 Doolittle Raid, but Halsey's health breaks down also this year. Why was the Pacific War so taxing on naval commanders? Was it just the stress, or why was it so taxing on these guys?
So, there's a lot of stress of command. One thing that this is one of the things that people don't often realize about Halsey. So his dad had suffered from some mental health issues, probably related to alcoholism. And so, in fact, that's actually what stalls the elder William's career after the turn of the century. For younger Bill, in fact, he has a stay. He never really talked about it much later in his life, but he suffers from what we would probably nowadays call like a depressive episode in 1914 and 1915. And he's not that far from probably being removed from the Navy. It's a pretty serious episode. He recovers from that, but he also suffers from skin conditions on and off. It's an occasional thing, but the stresses of command, they're at sea a lot. He's separated from his family. It also doesn't help his wife by this point is showing lots of her own mental health issues. And so, in fact, for most of the war, she's more or less in the care of a family friend back on the mainland.
Yeah, and I was reading up on it. Like, apparently his skin condition was so bad he couldn't even sleep. It was just that itchy and bothersome to him.
Yeah, he couldn't. Yeah, so if he would try to sleep, it was like naked on his bed with fresh sheets, and he needed to be coated in talcum powder. And even then, he couldn't get any relief for it. And so when he comes back, too late to make the Battle of Coral Sea, and when Enterprise comes back to Pearl, he actually leaves the ship on a stretcher. So Nimitz goes out of his way to try to hide this. They don't want to put him on the sick list. They don't want him removed from command. And so he essentially just detaches very quietly and informally detaches Halsey from duty. And so Halsey goes to Virginia and gets treatment from a doctor there who comes up with a couple of different treatments that he suffers a flare-up later in the war, but for the most part, that doctor finally figures out how to get his skin condition under control. And so for the most part, even though Halsey is going to be suffering from a lot of stress later in the war, he doesn't really have to deal with the skin conditions in quite the same way.
Yeah, he recovers from the skin ailments and returns to duty, but he missed the famous U.S. victory at the Battle of Midway, which he calls the greatest disappointment of his career. Where is he assigned next?
So after he returns to duty, he comes back to Pearl. He still holds an administrative title of the commander of aircraft squadrons in the Pacific, and so he's getting brought back up to speed for a little bit. And then in October of 42, he is dispatched by Nimitz to Admiral Chester Nimitz, Kimmel's replacement as the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet, to take an inspection tour of the South Pacific region. And Halsey is scheduled to visit with Admiral Robert Gormley, who is the commander of the South Pacific Theater. And only after he embarks on the inspection tour does he actually understand that his orders are to relieve Gormley. He was not aware of this when he left.
Reading on that Nimitz was unhappy with Gormley, whose performance had become lackluster and somewhat defeatist, and I think he was just trying to reinvigorate that area.
Yeah, Gormley, so the Navy of the interwar and early war years, it's a very small fraternity. Most of these guys know each other in some way and have known each other for some time. Halsey actually doesn't know Nimitz very well. They kind of know each other, but they're not really in the same circles. But you can usually draw lines. It's 6 degrees of separation. You really only need probably about 2 or 3 to probably connect Halsey to most every other senior officer in the Navy. At this point in the war, before the Navy has really had a chance to expand to anywhere near the size that it reaches in 1945. And so there's a lot of apprehension that Halsey had about replacing Gormley. But he can also see when he arrives down in Noumea that the situation down there is pretty dire. So it's a reluctant acceptance of his new duty, but it is an acceptance.
Well, yeah, I was going to ask you how he reinvigorated morale, but I guess winning usually does the trick.
So it's a complicated story. So some of this is Gormley's style just did not lend itself well to inspiring others to fight. Gormley spends most of his time cooped up on his command ship, which is the transport Argonne in Noumea. Very insular, doesn't really make any public appearances doesn't really leave the ship very often, but let alone does he go to visit the front. In fact, officers like Nimitz and Arnold had seen more of the front in the South Pacific than Gormley had, and he's the theater down there. And Gormley, to be fair, there's a few things going on here. Gormley, the South Pacific Theater, it's on the border of Halsey's Southwest Pacific Theater and Nimitz's Pacific Theater. And so whoever's in command there has to play well with both the Army and the Navy. And this is by far the most fractious command relationship you see at any point, I would say, among the Allies in World War II, is sorting out who actually is in command in the Pacific. Some of this is Gormley's personality. Some of this is just Gormley is horribly under-resourced, and it's just a bad mix all around. So Halsey at least can very easily fix the inspiration side of things. How can you get soldiers, sailors, and Marines to want to fight?
Yeah, and Gormley, in fairness to him, probably dealing with egos like MacArthur's, and it's a hard thing to do.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, Halsey is promoted to 4-star admiral for his can-do abilities. What were his relationship? I know you touched on it with Nimitz, but just superiors and his bosses, because I know he likes to speak his mind.
Yeah, Halsey has a fairly good relationship with Nimitz, at least earlier in the war, though they do take some issue with some of the liberties that he takes. So there's a few things that Halsey's time as the commander of the South Pacific, there's a few indirect accounts of this. So James Michener, who serves in the South Pacific, was supposed to write an official history of the South Pacific, and ends up turning this into Tales of the South Pacific. It's a Pulitzer Prize winner. And so you get a sense of like just what the culture is like in Noumea in general, and around Halsey in particular. James Bassett is a PAO in the South Pacific, and after the war, he goes on to write Harm's Way, which is then turned into the movie In Harm's Way in 1964. In fact, if you're familiar with some of the people who serve on Halsey's staff down there, you can see a lot of parallels between Halsey's staff members and characters in the film. So, like for instance, Burgess Meredith's character, who works for John Wayne in the film, is based in part on Gene Markey, who's a screenwriter and producer who's on Halsey's staff in the South Pacific. But one of the things where I think Halsey, at this point in the war, where he runs into problems with Nimitz and also with King, is sometimes his choices with staff. But I think Nimitz does give Halsey some deference in terms of, delegates, and Halsey is also a master delegator in terms of his command style. It's actually one of the things I think that makes Halsey fairly successful in the South Pacific, is he's more of a results guy than a process guy. For instance, when you look at how joint operations are managed elsewhere in the Pacific, Nimitz has a looser style than MacArthur. MacArthur very famously tries to keep everything tightly controlled by him or his headquarters. Halsey doesn't really care where assets come from, and he plays well with the Army, plays well with the Marine Corps, plays well with the Army Air Forces, and so this is how you can end up with air operations in the South Pacific of having these completely heterogeneous formations of aircraft. You've got Army aircraft, Navy aircraft, Marine aircraft. There's aircraft from New Zealand going out on the same strike mission. It's just routine. It's a Thursday for them.
And that goes back to just get it done.
Yeah.
We'll figure it out. I'm going to delegate it to you, but you get it done.
Yeah, and so for instance, when you look at the famous mission that Halsey wholeheartedly endorses to assassinate Yamamoto in April of '43, it's Navy code breakers. His air commander is Mark Mitcher, who had previously been commander of the Hornet, and so Mitcher delegates the planning of the operation to a Marine, but then it's Army Air Force's aircraft who end up doing the mission to kill Yamamoto, and all of this is put together in about 48 hours. But I think it just speaks to the fact that he built a command system that's trying to get these people are not always easy people to get along with, but he figures out how to build a system of command in which you can get people to play well with one another, which is not always easy to do in military circles.
Right. Well, the U.S. wins again, this time the famous Battle of Guadalcanal. How integral is Halsey here?
So Halsey is very important. This is one of the things I was trying to touch on earlier with Gormley, is one thing that really helps Halsey, and also it's this thing that helps Halsey to some degree, and how people view him versus Frank Jack Fletcher, who was at Midway, and he's in the South Pacific for a brief period, is the fact that Halsey starts to get more resources under his control. More aircraft, more soldiers, more Marines. And Halsey recognizes in some ways that this is going to be an attritional fight in a way I don't think Gormley ever, from a personality standpoint, would have ever been able to adjust it. And and so this is where Halsey's abilities as an inspirational leader, his willingness to delegate, I think his ability to focus on the problem. He recognizes the problem is really Guadalcanal, where Gormley had all these other ideas about operations that needed to be conducted, and Halsey cancels other operations and just starts throwing as much resources into Guadalcanal as he can, because he recognizes this is where the fight's going to be. And using ships in unconventional ways, at a certain point, just because of the damage that's been done to the U.S. Navy's carrier force, tries to leave the carriers in, not that they are not useful in certain contexts, but when he recognizes that carriers should be used very carefully when they're within range of land-based aircraft. And so this becomes a fight, a lot of surface fights, and carriers being used very sparingly. Enterprise barely survives 1942. Hornet is sunk. Wasp is sunk. Saratoga spends the latter part of 1942 under repairs. Lexington is gone. So at one point, Halsey and King actually end up having to petition the British to get reinforcements from them. And so HMS Victorious spends several months in the South Pacific in 1943 just because the Americans have run out of carriers.
Yeah. But as you mentioned, kind of like Admiral Nelson, he's at the front lines. He's not way back on some flagship.
Yeah. So one thing that Halsey does, so he moves ashore at Noumea. He wants to be seen. He also moves in some ways the supply lines closer to the front, so this way more of this material can hit to Guadalcanal and get into the Solomons as quickly as possible. He puts a Navy admiral, Admiral Calhoun, who's a descendant of John C. Calhoun, in charge of Navy logistics. Eventually, an Army logistician is brought in and really starts to speed up the process by which stuff can get to the front.
Yeah.
And so this is actually one of the things I think where Halsey really deserves a lot of credit is shortening the lines of logistics and just getting as much stuff to the front as can be done. And what he recognizes is that the U.S. can replace these assets, even when they lose pilots. The U.S. has a pilot training system in place that allows them to replace, as pilots, they fly a certain number of missions and they're sent back home and then they train the next generation. And so, you're never going to get, with the exception of a very few, like these famed aces like what you see in Germany or Japan, but their pilots are serving until they die.
Right. Halsey spends 1943 battling up the Solomon chains, and it seems to go very well. And this is where he's kind of making a name for himself.
Yeah. So Guadalcanal finally comes under Allied control in February of 1943 when the Japanese withdraw. Now, there is a little bit of a lag in getting the offensive up the Solomon started. Some of that is, there's various reasons for this. Some of this has to do with MacArthur. Some of this has to do with various things. So it's not until the latter part of 1943 where you really start to see significant movement up the Solomon chain. But this is where you start to see, in some ways, it's a very early version of island hopping. So the first major target is New Georgia, which takes a while. It's kind of an ugly campaign, but trying to seize an airfield there. But they recognize that there's a big Japanese garrison there, but the nearby island of Vella La Vella is not very well held. Why don't we just seize that? Because really this is one thing I think that I think your listeners should probably understand about the war in the Pacific. There are very few places in the Pacific that actually have a lot of value. What you're really after are airfields and ports.
Yep.
And for the most part, there's enough places in the Pacific where you can find good anchorages or good ports that you never really need to overinvest in developing one place or another. So like the Philippines has some symbolic value, both as a former American colony, but also because of MacArthur. Some places, for instance, the oil fields in Borneo have value. The Japanese are getting rubber and tin out of Southeast Asia. So there are some resources here. But for the most part in the Pacific where the U.S. is fighting, it's basically where can you build an airfield and where can you anchor ships.
Welcome back to part 2 of our episode on Admiral Halsey. Our good friend Ryan Wadle is joining us yet again. He has a different background in Hack because we had a little recording issue, but now we've got everything straightened out on the second part of our Halsey interview. And Ryan, we appreciate you coming back on the show.
Glad to be back.
All right. I think where we left off with Halsey, like things were he was tracking very well. Like things are going great. He's winning battles. He's doing very well. But then we kind of get late into 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Battle off Samar, and Operation Cobra. Were these operations damaging to Halsey's reputation?
Very much so. So after Halsey finds success in the Solomons, he rotates in. So they devise a scheme in the Pacific Fleet where he and Admiral Spruance will rotate command of the U.S. Navy's main fleet. Under Spruance, it's the 5th Fleet. Under Halsey, it will become the 3rd Fleet. And so when Halsey takes command, even though he's been in the thick of things in the Solomons, in some ways the war has changed quite a bit, and what is expected of the carrier task force commanders and the fleet commander has changed quite a bit since he's really been in command of the fleet. And so at Leyte Gulf, so even though he and Spruance actually had a fairly good relationship, Halsey had been upset that Spruance had seemingly let the Japanese carrier task forces escape at the Battle of Philippine Sea. And so he's already thinking, like, I'm not going to let this happen again. And so the Japanese actually devise a battle plan thinking along the lines of, Halsey or somebody will go after the carriers, even though the carriers basically have like no air power left.
I like this part because Halsey's on the Japanese radar and they're like, we have to do something to trick this guy or get him out of our hair.
Yeah. And, Halsey is still has that aggressiveness. So when he's in command of the fleet, when they raid the Philippines, even before the invasion happens, he's the one who the aviators come back and say, hey, we're not really finding targets. He thinks the Philippines are an empty shell. And so he actually persuades Nimitz to move up the invasion timeline. And this all goes back to the Joint Chiefs, and there's a bunch of radio traffic, but all this comes back fairly quickly. And they move up the invasion timeline. And so Halsey is in command of the fleet when the Japanese try to respond to the U.S. invasion of Leyte. And so Halsey issues this series of orders that appears he has created a separate battleship task force in case the Japanese try to force their way through the San Bernardino Straits. But it's ambiguous as to whether or not this was ever actually acted upon. He just says this is something that's in the hopper. And so when the carrier task force is discovered, takes the carriers off to destroy the Japanese. The battleships are actually going to hopefully eventually sink them with gunfire. But the main Japanese task force coming through the San Bernardino Strait, which had initially turned around after a series of air attacks. This is where the Musashi, the sister ship to the Yamato, one of the Japanese super battleships, is sunk. Japanese come roaring back through San Bernardino Straits, and instead of finding Halsey's task force, they find a bunch of destroyer escorts and destroyers and escort carriers who are doing everything that they can to fight off the Japanese. And it's easily one of the most heroic efforts in U.S. naval history. All these little ships, all these aircraft that are not really armed to do anti-ship attacks, trying to fend off this massive Japanese fleet. And several of the destroyer escorts go down. One of the carriers is sunk by gunfire, but Admiral Kurita, who's in charge of the task force, thinks Halsey must be around here somewhere. He's running low on ammunition, I think. And then so he actually goes back through the straits. And so this effort works. Meanwhile, all of these task force commanders are sending off all these messages trying to figure out, like, where the heck is Halsey? And so this makes its way back to Nimitz. Nimitz is trying to figure out what's going on. And so because of the way in which they would pad message traffic, whenever he tries to radio Halsey, like, where are you? The message comes through, where is Task Force 38, the World Wonders. The World Wonders was just supposed to be padding that was left off, but it looks like it's part of the message. And so Halsey gets this and just loses his mind. But he turns around just before they come into contact with what's left of the Japanese carrier task force.
So he has a bit of egg on his face.
Yes, yeah. And so there's some recriminations after this. So, in fact, after the war, he actually gets into a campaign to defend his reputation because Samuel Eliot Morison, the famous naval historian, as he's writing his accounts of the U.S. Navy in the Pacific, writes some things that are very critical of Halsey. And so Halsey is going back and forth with some of his friends, comrades, former staff officers. And he insinuates that he would like to put Morison's, shall we say, parts in a vice because he's this unhappy. And so this is something that actually consumes a lot of his energy after the war. But this is not the only thing that Halsey has a problem with in fall of 1944. So not too long after this, in December, Halsey is in command of the fleet. They're supporting the landings off Luzon, and they have a set of strikes set for the next day. Meanwhile, there's a hurricane coming in. His aerologist, which, by the way, one of my students this past year at the Naval War College, his name is Mike Bell. It looks like Beal, but pronounced Bell. Mike, here's the shout out for you. I did pronounce your name correctly. Just looked a lot at how Halsey's aerologist, which is what they called meteorologist at the time,
right,
was trained. And so he thinks the storm is going to go off in a different direction. There's a series of really bad calculations. And instead, Halsey ends up taking his task force in the middle of a typhoon. And there are 3 destroyers that are capsized and sunk with almost all hands. Fleet suffers an incredible amount of damage from this. And yeah, Halsey takes, this is another big black mark on his reputation. So for a guy who for the most part had been avoided a lot of controversy in some of his previous commands, or at least things had been minor enough where they'd been able to ignore them, like now he's got 2 really big kind of public problems that have blown up in his face.
Yeah, well, the guy he replaced was replaced for being too cautious, and then Halsey wasn't cautious enough, and here we are.
Yeah, so this is one of the ironies of command in the Pacific in World War II is Spruance is not an aviator. And so there's a lot of criticism amongst some of the aviator crowd, which Halsey was a part of, about whether or not Spruance was well suited for command of the carrier task force. But with the way the war evolves by 44 and 45, it's actually much better suited to Spruance's strengths. He's much more organized, much more disciplined. And this is a style of warfare and command that suits him very well, where Halsey is best when he can improvise. So what he's having to deal with in 44 and into 45 are not always suited to his improvisational strengths. You need basically a manager, not a kind of a fire breather like what he had been known as previously in the war.
Yeah, and the war ends 1945. And interestingly, Halsey was still concerned about Japanese kamikaze attacks, instructing his fleet, quote, cessation of hostilities, war is over. If any Japanese airplanes appear, shoot them down in a friendly way, end quote. So it kind of reminds me of Patton in a way. He's not afraid to speak his mind.
Oh no, definitely not. That never really goes away. One thing to keep in mind with the kamikaze is so it appears roughly simultaneously with the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 44. And so Halsey and Mark Mitcher, who was the carrier task force commander he normally worked for Spruance, but he was still in command at Leyte Gulf. He's replaced by John McCain. This is the grandfather of Senator John McCain. And so Halsey this is a major problem for the fleet. They don't really know how to solve it. The Japanese had for most of 1944 not figured out an effective way to penetrate the defensive screen that the American carrier task forces had put up between new doctrine, new technology, better fighters. The carrier task forces were much better protected than what they had been early in the war when Halsey's in command. And so Halsey and McCain try to develop a series of tactics to neutralize the threat. Some of them involve what they call the Big Blue Blanket, basically keeping fighters over Japanese airfields where kamikaze raids may come from. They try to devise decoy tactics. They come up with radar picket destroyers to station them farther out to give them more advanced warning of raids. Because what the Japanese are doing, instead of sending like big raids, they're sending aircraft in very small groups from all sorts of different vectors. And so it's much harder for the combat air patrol to respond to this. And then also the fact that since you're using an airplane basically as a missile, just with a human as the guidance computer, they don't really care if they're getting shot down as long as they're pointed at the direction of the ship. And so this is a really major problem. And Halsey suffers under it again off of Okinawa, and when the carriers are raiding Japan in the last months of the war as well.
Right. Well, after the war, he has another quote that I find very interesting. He's asked which weapons used to win the war were the most effective, and he replies, quote, if I had to give credit to the instruments and machines that won us the war in the Pacific, I would rate them in this order. Submarines first, radar second, planes third, bulldozers fourth, end quote. The interesting part, other than submarines, there's no battleships or any kind of boats on here, which is strange for a naval officer, in my opinion.
Yeah, so the submarines, Halsey's not super connected to the submarine campaigns. Those are generally being directed by others. American Submarine Force devastates the Japanese merchant shipping traffic during the war, and so at the cost of basically it's 52 submarines sunk during the war. For the most part, the American submarines almost effectively strangle Japanese merchant traffic. The Japanese have a maritime empire, and they need the sea lines of communication open. And the submarines, especially by 44 and 45, are interdicting those. Radar is pretty self-explanatory. Planes, bulldozers. I think the other thing that's important with that is, when you think about Halsey's time in the Solomons, it's the ability of Seabees and other American engineers to show up in these godforsaken places that have bad soil. There's trees, jungle, all sorts of just the elements working against you. And the fact that they can show up and carve airstrips out of nothing in a fairly short amount of time, this is what enables many of the advances that Halsey and other American commanders like MacArthur can make, because it's always about fighting for the next port or the next airfield. Nothing in the Pacific, for the most part, outside of the Philippines, really has a whole lot of intrinsic strategic value. And so the ability to create these airfields is vital for the war.
What were his later years like? I know he's married and he has two kids. And you also mentioned he's defending his reputation a bit.
Yeah, so he's trying to defend his reputation. He's in the public eye for a while after the war. One thing that he's working on at the time that he dies, so the actor Robert Montgomery had served on his staff for a while during World War II. And can't remember if we mentioned this before, but one of the other staff officers or other staffers who were around him were James Michener, who wrote Tales of the South Pacific, which, by the way, I had to order a new copy, so here it is. And he's also got James Bassett. James Bassett goes on to write Harm's Way, which is turned into the film In Harm's Way. So it kind of dramatizes some of the elements of Halsey's career. And so you can actually see, if you're familiar with some of the staff that Halsey has in the South Pacific, you can see some of these characters in Michener's works and Bassett's work. But Montgomery, after the war, produces a biopic of Halsey called The Gallant Hours with Jimmy Cagney as Halsey. It's actually a fairly good film. Cagney does look a decent bit like Halsey by that point in his career. And it's a very thoughtful look of Halsey in command in the South Pacific, and so deals with him, for instance, at the time of the assassination of Yamamoto and the decision to leave that or to order that mission, and also his time in Guadalcanal. And so it's a very thoughtful biopic for someone who is generally known for being this very rabble-rousing, action-oriented kind of guy. It's actually a fairly good movie. You don't see it on TV very often. Sometimes it pops up on Turner Classic. It might be streaming somewhere, but yeah, I would recommend your listeners check it out.
Movie recommendation from Ryan.
Yeah.
He dies at 59 at the age of 76.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. One of the other last things that he does is, so when the Enterprise is sold for scrap, there's a last minute campaign to try to save her as a museum. There's actually kind of a half-baked plan to float her up the Potomac. And so she would have been parked roughly about where the FDR Memorial is now as a museum ship. Needless to say, that did not happen. And so Halsey, even though he's not in great health, actually does try to put his name behind the campaign, but it's unsuccessful. So the Enterprise goes to the scrapyards in 59 as well.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. And I was thinking about like great naval heroes of U.S. history, and you have John Paul Jones, you have Nimitz, you have, I guess, Halsey. So where do you think he is in the pantheon? Like he's probably Mount Rushmore of naval heroes.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, even with the problems that he creates for himself in 44 and 45, there's another typhoon that causes problems for him actually as well. But even in spite of those problems, like, yeah, he's easily amongst the biggest American naval heroes of all time. There's a reason why he gets the Fifth Star from Congress. His takes a little while longer to come in than some of the others, in part because of the controversy. And so he actually gets a Fifth Star over Spruance. Though Spruance gets the consolation prize of a lifetime pension, full pay pension from Congress. Yeah, he deserves the accolades he gets, and but I think one thing to remember with Halsey, like with a lot of other historical figures, is no one is perfect, and he's a complicated guy in a lot of ways, both good and bad. But even the complications, I don't think, should detract from the good things that he did, especially in 42 and 43.
Yeah, the positives outweigh the negatives for sure. And yeah, interesting stuff on Halsey. So yeah, thank you for that, Ryan. Ryan Wadle joining us for the Admiral Halsey podcast, and we thank you for your time, sir.
Yeah, glad to be here.